Wyoming Territory, July 1879. The wind howled through the dried ribs of the abandoned stable outside of Rawlins, carrying with it the sharp scent of dust, old straw, and something else, fear. Inside, tucked behind a leaning stall door, her white dress torn at the hem and smeared with dirt, Tessa Mayfield pressed her back flat against the rough wood and held her breath. Her wedding veil lay crumpled beside her. Forgotten, she had run. Run from the church, from the man her father insisted she marry, from the future laid out like a noose. The moment she saw Bernard Calhoun's face at the altar, smug, 45, and already drunk on whiskey and victory, something inside her snapped. She could not do it. She would not be bought. So she ran. Barefoot through back alleys, past stunned townsfolk, through sagebrush till her lungs gave out and her dress caught on barbed wire. She had stumbled into the stable, deserted for years, and collapsed into the shadows. Now, hours later, her lips were cracked and her knees ached, but she did not move. The sun was sliding low when the crunch of hooves reached her ears. She tensed, shrinking into the shadows. The rider dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with soft, measured thuds. A saddle creaked. Then silence, and then a voice. "You hiding from someone, or something?" Tessa's heart slammed against her ribs. She peeked through the slats. The man standing just inside the broken doors was tall, his brown coat dusty from the trail, a rifle strapped across his back. His hat was tipped low, but she caught the edge of his jaw, the way he scanned the dark corners with caution, not aggression. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, voice calm. "Name's Elias Darnell, just looking for a quiet place to water my horse." Tessa stepped out slowly, eyes locked on him. "You a sheriff?" "No, ma'am," Elias said, removing his hat. "Just a cowboy passing through. You look like you been through something rough." She crossed her arms over her chest. "You could say that." He took in her torn dress, bare feet, and the veil she had dropped. His gaze softened. "You ran from a wedding." "Not a wedding, a sentence." He nodded once. "Want me to take you back?" Her chin lifted. "You planning to drag me?" "No, ma'am, I am offering to help if you want it. That's all." Tessa stared at him, her whole body still coiled tight. But there was no threat in his stance, no heat in his voice, just steady, quiet concern. "I cannot go back," she whispered. "My father will force me to marry him. Bernard Calhoun owns half the freight lines between here and Laramie. He offered a dowry to settle Papa's debts." Elias shifted his weight. "So he sold you?" She nodded, eyes stinging. "I would rather starve in the wilderness than be chained to a man like that." "Then you will not starve," Elias said simply. "Not while I am here." He offered her his canteen, and when she took it, her hands shook. She drank deeply, then handed it back with a quiet "thank you." "I know a place," he said. "An old line shack 2 ridges west. No one goes there but me. You would be safe a while, till you figure your next step." She studied him. His face was sun-browned, the lines around his eyes carved by wind and time, but there was no cruelty in him, no false charm. He looked like the kind of man who kept his word because no one had ever given him reason not to. And for the first time since she fled, something inside her eased. "All right," she said. "I will go with you." They rode in silence as the sky turned gold, then navy. Tessa sat behind Elias on his bay mare, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed to his back. She felt the rise and fall of his breath, the steady thump of his heart beneath her palm. By the time they reached the shack, the stars had bloomed overhead. It was small, one room with a stone hearth, a cot and a table, but it was clean. Safe. Elias built a fire while she sat on the cot, her hands in her lap. "I do not know what happens next," she said quietly. "We do not have to know all of it tonight," Elias replied, setting a tin cup in front of her. "We just have to get through the next morning." She looked up at him. Why are you helping me? You do not know me. Maybe not, he said, but I know what it is to be alone, and I know what it is to need someone who does not ask for anything in return. His voice was low, almost careful. Tessa blinked, surprised by the emotion behind it. Did someone leave you? She asked. Elias gave a small nod. My wife, 5 years ago, took sick and went fast. Since then it's been me and the trail. I am sorry, she whispered. He shrugged. I am not the only man to lose someone. But I reckon I never expected to find anything new. Their eyes met across the firelight, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Tessa finally looked away. I do not want to be a burden. You are not. You do not even know my full name, he smiled, the first real one she had seen. Then maybe you should tell me. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. Tessa Mayfield. Well, Miss Mayfield, he said warmly, this place is yours as long as you need it. That night she lay on the cot while Elias slept near the fire. The wind whispered outside, but inside something had shifted. She was not alone anymore. And for the first time in her life, she felt like someone had truly seen her, not as a bride, not as a bargain, but as a person. She closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for a while, that maybe something good was beginning. The next morning came in hushed gray light, the kind that slips in slow and quiet, unbothered by the weight of what came before it. Tessa opened her eyes to the smell of ash and pine smoke, her limbs sore from sleep, not fear. Elias sat by the hearth, mending the torn strap of his saddlebag with a curved needle and a strip of rawhide. He didn't glance over, just worked in steady rhythm, his brow drawn in quiet focus. She sat up, brushing her hair away from her face. You always start the day without breakfast, Elias answered without looking up. Fire needed tending first. There's dried venison and coffee if you're of the mind. Her stomach answered for her. She stood, gathering her skirt to keep from dragging it through the ashes scattered near the hearth. The kettle on the stone ledge bubbled gently, scent sharp and bitter. She poured herself a cup, careful not to spill. You do this often? She asked, sipping from the tin. Take in strangers. That was the first time, he said simply, testing the stitch with a tug, then setting the leather aside. Didn't feel right leaving you there. I wasn't expecting anyone to look me in the eye and see anything other than trouble. He finally met her gaze. I saw someone who needed a way out. That's not trouble. That's just a turn in the road. Tessa wasn't sure what surprised her more, that he offered kindness without hesitation, or that she hadn't flinched from it. Where will you go next? He asked. She hesitated. My mother was born in Helena. I thought maybe if I could get there, I might find someone who remembers her. Her maiden name was Holloway. Montana Territory's a long ride, he said. You can't make it alone, not without coin or a proper mount. She looked down into her cup. I don't have either. Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I could take you part of the way. I've got a job starting near Snake River in a few weeks. If we travel careful, we could reach the edge of Montana before then. Tessa blinked. Why would you do that? Because no one should have to earn their freedom on foot. He said it without ceremony, like a man who'd once walked too far under the weight of his own choices. She nodded slowly. All right, I'll ride with you. But if I'm to be a passenger, I want to pull my weight. You know how to shoot. My brother taught me to aim. Never fired at anything living. He rose, retrieving a small revolver from his saddlebag and checking the cylinder. Then we'll start with bottles and fence posts. They spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies: dried beans, salt, a few biscuits wrapped in linen. Elias offered her a pair of boots from a trunk in the corner, worn but whole. She pulled them on, grateful for anything between her and the earth. By midday they were on the trail, the mare trotting at a safe pace over the scrubbed hills. Elias led, reins loose in his hand while Tessa rode behind once more, posture slowly adjusting to the rhythm beneath her. "You always this quiet on the trail?" she asked after a while. "Only when there's nothing worth crowding the air over." She smiled, more to herself than anything. "I think I like that." They stopped near a bend in the land where a spring trickled through a tangle of cottonwoods. Elias tied the mare and knelt by the water. Tessa crouched beside him, cupping her hands in the cold stream. When she looked up, he was watching the sky. "You ever think of leaving Wyoming for good?" she asked, shaking water from her fingers. He shrugged. "Some men are meant to keep moving. I reckon I'm one of them. But even a trail ends somewhere. Maybe, or maybe it just runs long enough that you stop caring where it goes." She studied his profile, the scar just beneath his jaw, the way his lashes caught the sun. "I think you care more than you let on." He turned to her, expression unreadable. "What makes you say that? You offered safety without asking a thing from me. You wake up early to fix what's broken. You listen more than you speak." That doesn't sound like a man who stopped caring. A long silence passed between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves. "I lost more than a wife when Lorna died," he said, voice low. "I lost the part of myself that knew how to belong." Tessa didn't respond with pity. She only reached out and placed her hand on his, not a gesture of comfort, but recognition. He didn't pull away. They made camp that night beneath a canopy of stars, near a ridge where the wind softened and the air turned sweet with wild sage. Elias built the fire while she unpacked the bedrolls. When the flames licked high, casting gold across the dust, he offered her his coat. She took it without a word, slipping it over her shoulders. "Tomorrow we'll ride early," he said. "The pass ahead gets rough by midday." "You think we'll make it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her in the firelight, something shifting in his gaze. Not desire, something deeper, quieter. "If you're beside me," he said, "I think we'll make it just fine." Tessa tucked her knees beneath her chin and watched the fire crackle between them. She didn't know what lay ahead, not in Helena, not in the days between. But in that moment, she felt no fear. Only the steady presence of the man who had found her in ruin and never once asked her to explain it. And for the first time since she'd fled that chapel, she let her heart rest. The trail north bent through gulches and low ridgelines, where the scent of ironweed thickened in the heat, and the horses picked their steps careful over loose shale. By the third day, the land had grown quieter. No homesteads. No male riders, just the wide ache of open Wyoming and the steady rhythm of hooves. Elias led with a patience born of long years alone. He didn't speak unless there was something to say, and Tessa found she liked the silence between them. It wasn't empty. It held space for thought, for breath, for whatever might come next. That evening they camped near a dry creek bed where red cliffs leaned close, and the wind curled low like it didn't feel the need to shout. Tessa pulled a wool blanket around her shoulders and sat near the fire, her knees drawn up, fingers tight around a cup of boiled chicory. Elias was across from her, cleaning his rifle with a strip of oiled cloth. "You said you lost your wife," she said finally, her voice even. "But you never said what kind of woman she was." Elias paused, then set the rifle aside. "Lorna didn't speak much unless she was certain of her words. She taught school in Cheyenne before we married. She used to keep a book of pressed wildflowers. Said everyone had a name worth remembering." Tessa tilted her head. "You miss her still?" He didn't nod. He didn't need to. Some people don't leave when they die, they just go quiet inside you. The fire cracked and settled lower. Tessa watched the flame tip sideways, then right itself. "I used to think I'd never be more than someone's possession," she said. "My mother died young, and everything after that was dresses I didn't pick, lessons I didn't want, and men my father smiled too wide around." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Then why Helena? She kept a journal. My mother. I found it in a chest when I was 12 and read it by candlelight for weeks. She wrote about the way the cottonwoods moved near the Missouri, how the mountains looked silver at dusk. I clung to her words like they were a map out. He watched her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket. I've got something. Found it years back. He pulled out a small, palm-sized tin and opened it. Inside were 6 delicate leaves, pale yellow and laced with green veins. Golden currant, he said, grows near the Snake River in spring. Lorna showed me how to press them so they'd keep. Tessa touched one lightly with her fingertip. She would have liked your steadiness. Elias looked down at the tin. She once told me that nothing rooted strong without time. Said people were the same. Tessa closed the lid gently. Then I reckon we're doing all right. They didn't speak again that night, but something shifted. The air between them settled deeper, like the roots she'd just spoken of reaching into the ground below their fire. The next morning they broke camp before the sun cleared the ridge. Elias adjusted the saddle bags, scanning the sky. Storm's coming. We'll need to make the foothills by evening. Tessa mounted behind him, her hands steady at his waist. They rode hard through the day, wind rising sharp by afternoon. Dust lifted in swirls across the land, and by the time they reached the shelter of a rocky shelf near the pine edge, the clouds behind them were thick with threat. Inside the narrow overhang, Elias unpacked a canvas sheet and tied it between branches for cover. Tessa gathered kindling from beneath the pines while he struck a fire near the rock wall. Rain came fast first light, then driving, and they sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the canvas, watching it bead and slide off in curtains. She glanced at him, his jaw flecked with rain, hair damp at the temples. You ever think about starting over? He didn't answer at once. Then, I used to think it meant forgetting. Now I think it means choosing. And what would you choose? He met her eyes then, something slow and unguarded in his expression. Someone who doesn't look away when it gets hard. Tessa let her breath out slow. I'm not sure where I'm going ends in safety. Then I'll ride with you until it does. She looked down at her hands, then back up. And if it never does, his voice was low, steady. Then I'll keep riding. The rain slowed. The fire hissed and held. And in that quiet space, full of pine smoke and the low hum of wind against stone, Tessa leaned her head to his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her rest there. They stayed like that until the light faded and the storm passed them by. The wind had dropped by morning, leaving the world rinsed clean and still. Mist clung low to the ground, curling through the sagebrush. Elias stepped away from the fire's ashes, his boots sinking into damp earth, and checked the mare's hooves for stone. She stood patient as he ran his hand down her foreleg and cleared a wedge of grit from beneath the shoe. Tessa packed the bedrolls without being asked. Her movements had grown fluid, practiced. She folded the canvas tarp and tied it against the saddle bundle, glancing toward the ridgeline where sunlight leaned through the thinning fog. We'll reach the river fork by nightfall if the path stays dry, Elias said, rising and brushing his palms off on his trousers. She nodded, tightening the last strap. And after that, southwest through the timber. There's a trading post near the edge of the Absaroka, quiet place, no lawmen, no freight men. You could send word ahead if you needed. I've no one to send word to, she said, brushing her hands clean on her skirt, but I'd like to see it anyway. They rode through the morning with the sun at their backs, shadows stretching long ahead of them across the slope. The trail narrowed between 2 hills where the earth had split from spring runoff, and they dismounted to lead the mare single file through the wash. At the bottom, the mud was thick and black, clinging to their boots. Elias paused halfway through and looked at the sky. Storm must have soaked this basin hard. Best we keep north of the lowland after this." Tessa watched him for a moment, then asked, "Were you raised in Wyoming, Dakota Territory?" "My father worked cattle near the Knife River. Ma died when I was young. He sent me west after a branding accident took his leg. Said there wasn't use for both of us starving." She stepped carefully around a tangle of roots. "Did you ever go back?" "No. By the time I had the coin, he was buried on a bluff with a wooden marker, and no one left near enough to visit." Tessa gripped the reins tighter. "What was he like?" "Hard man. Didn't speak unless it was to correct you. But he taught me how to read a trail, how to clean a wound, and how to never take more than I could carry." They reached higher ground again, the trail widening into open scrub dotted with rabbit brush. The mare snorted and shook her mane. Elias handed the reins back to Tessa and mounted up beside her. "You ever wish you'd done something different?" she asked, settling behind him once more. He gave the reins a light shake. "Not in the ways that count." They didn't speak for hours after that. The land unfurled slowly around them, changing from flat rock to pine-dotted slope, the air cooling as elevation rose. At mid-afternoon, Elias pointed to a line of smoke on the horizon. "Burned scar," he said. "Old logging camp, I think. We'll cut wide around it." By dusk, they reached a bluff overlooking the river fork. The water bent in two directions, glinting blue and white in the failing light. Tessa slid down from the saddle and walked to the edge, boots crunching against gravel. Elias joined her, arms crossed against the breeze. "You ever think about buying land?" she asked after a while. "I did once. Near Lander. Stream ran through the north edge. I built a lean-to and planted potatoes. Lorna and I were going to raise chickens." Tessa turned to look at him. "What happened?" "Season turned hard. We lost the crop. She took sick that winter and passed before the thaw. I left the land to rot." The wind stirred her hair across her cheek. "Would you try again?" He studied the river a long while. "Maybe. If there was someone to share it with." Her fingers curled at her sides, then unclenched. "I used to think I'd live in a house full of books. I thought I'd teach children how to read their own names." "Why didn't you?" "My father said there was no sense in a woman learning more than what she needed to run a kitchen and raise a child. Said education was wasted on a future wife." He turned to her, his voice quiet. "You still could." She met his gaze, steady. "I'd need someone who believed I could. I do." The fire that night was small, built with care behind a ridge of stone where the wind couldn't find it. Elias laid out the bedrolls side by side but didn't speak when he stepped away to give her space. Tessa sat near the flame, writing in a small leather-bound journal she'd kept tucked in her satchel. When she closed it, Elias was watching her from where he leaned against the saddle. She met his eyes across the fire. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe Helena isn't the only place a person can begin again." He didn't move. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if there's still land near Lander, and if you'd teach me how to plant something that'll grow, maybe I'd like to try." The fire snapped once, wood settling into coals. Elias stood slowly, walked to where she sat and knelt beside her. "You mean it?" "I wouldn't have said it otherwise." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then we'll go together, not just part way." She nodded, her voice low. "All the way." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the fire warming their faces. And for the first time since the stable, there was no need to run, only the quiet promise of something lasting, rising steady like dawn. They left the river fork just after sunrise, the sky a pale blue that deepened as they climbed toward higher ground. The mare walked slow along the wooded slope, her breath fogging in the cooler air. Above them, hawks circled on silent wings. By midday, the trail curved west into the hills. Snow still clung to the shaded side of the ridges. thin crusts tucked beneath fallen branches. Elias guided the mare around a fallen pine, and Tessa pressed her palm to the back of his coat, steadying herself as they passed through the narrow cut. "You think the land you mentioned still empty?" she asked once they cleared the trees. He nodded toward the horizon. "Nobody built much out here last I heard. Too far from the rail, too close to the wind." "I don't mind wind," she said. "So long as it's honest." Elias glanced back at her, a half-smile warming his face. "That it is." They made camp that night in a hollow beneath an outcrop of granite. The air held the bite of late spring, but the fire burned bright, and the stones at their backs kept the cold away. Tessa unpacked dried apples from her satchel and handed a few to Elias. "Did you always plan to ride alone?" she asked, watching the firelight move across the rock. "For a while it felt easier that way," he said. "No one to lose, no one to worry. And now," he looked at her, quiet and sure, "now I don't mind the worry, not if it means someone's waiting at the end of the day." She studied his face, the fire catching the edge of his brow, the slope of his cheek. "You're not who I expected to find when I ran." "Who were you expecting?" "Someone who'd treat me like a burden." "Or a mistake." "You're neither," her voice lowered. "You still want to build something in Lander, I do. Then I want to help." He reached for her hand, fingers rough but touch careful. "You sure?" "I've never been more." The next morning they turned southwest, toward the basin where the foothills widened and the wind scattered the scent of pine across the valley. 2 days later, they reached a narrow plateau. The land there sloped soft and green, a creek winding through the low center. Elias dismounted and walked the edge of the rise, boots pressing into the damp grass. Tessa followed, her eyes scanning the open stretch. "It's quiet." "It always was," Elias said, kneeling near the edge of the creek. "First time I saw it, I knew." "Knew what?" "That this was the kind of land you stay for." She knelt beside him, dipping her fingers into the cold water. "Then let's stay." He turned toward her, not with surprise, but with something deeper recognition. "You want this life?" "With me, I want what's honest, what's chosen, what grows slow and strong." He took her hands, his voice steady. "Then we'll build it." They worked through the summer. Elias cut timber from the north ridge and split boards beneath the sun. Tessa learned to mix lime for mortar and painted the inside walls with a brush she carved herself. They built a home with 2 rooms and a porch that faced the creek. She planted wild rose by the door. He shaped shelves for her books, and she taught him how to read the ones she'd carried in her pack. By the time the aspens turned gold, they were married in the field behind the house. No preacher, no guests, just the 2 of them beneath a sky that stretched wider than any chapel ceiling. Tessa wore a dress made from muslin she'd traded for at the post. Elias shaved and wore a clean shirt. They spoke vows they'd written in the quiet of the long evenings, promises made with no flourish, only truth. That first winter was hard. Snow piled high and the roof needed mending more than once. But they kept warm with fire and laughter, and when the nights stretched long, Elias read aloud from her journal while she stitched blankets by lantern light. Come spring, they bought 2 hens and a milk cow from a rancher who passed through. Tessa wrote to a woman in Laramie who ran a small school and asked for books and slates. By summer's end, she'd started teaching the neighboring children who came by horseback once a week. Elias cleared more land, built a corral, and smiled more often. They didn't speak much of the past. There was no need. What had come before had shaped them, but it did not lead them. They built their days on what was in front of them, the sound of boots on pine floors, the steam rising from morning coffee, the way her hand fit into his as they stood at the edge of the field watching the sun come up. Years passed steady and full. The garden grew. So did the shelves of books. They added a second room to the cabin, then a third. The porch sagged a little under the weight of time and use, but Elias never minded. He said it meant the place was lived in. Tessa never returned to Rawlins. There was no need. Her story had turned in the direction she'd chosen, the one where no part of her was handed over, where every word she spoke was her own. Elias never rode alone again. His trail ended at the house they built, where the wind hummed low through the grass and the creek kept its slow, sure pace. And each night, before the lamps were blown out, he reached for her hand, and she gave it freely. Not out of rescue or need, but love the kind that lasts because it is tended, not taken. And they lived the rest of their days just like that, together.